Thank you, all of you, for joining. I'm pleased to be here, and what I'm going to do today is present a little bit of a more positive story than maybe we've been hearing over the last several months. If there's one key message that I want to leave you with at this point, it's that we appear to be coming out of the trough that resulted from COVID-19 and efforts to contain it. We had a tough first half of this year, especially tough second quarter, tough economically, tough from a health perspective, tough psychologically. But we're starting now to see, with cases being contained and economies starting to reopen, economic activity picking up as those lockdowns are being eased. This is really good news after all the pain we've been through. Still some risks, which I'm going to talk a little bit about, but nevertheless, we appear to be reaching, or to have reached, that inflection point, that point in a change in direction where we're now starting to trend a little bit more positively. Just going to click down here. So begin with the Canadian economy, just some broad trends we're seeing across Canada. Then I'll move into some provincial trends and conclude with some final thoughts. One of the things that we do at Scotiabank Economics is that we work with other parts of the bank, lots of different other parts of the bank. Recently, we've gotten into some projects with our data science team looking at high volume consumer payment data that we're getting in aggregate from all of our business lines and all of our customers. What we're seeing from those data, as I'm demonstrating here on these slides, is that economic activity appears to be starting to stabilize after some of those very steep declines that we witnessed early in the year as lockdowns began. We've got rent payments for businesses starting to pick up from those really low points. And then in terms of the dollar volume of transactions by consumers across a range of different industries, the activity level, the volume is picking up. Some stronger than others, as we can see in the right, but generally speaking, after that huge decline that we started to see at the beginning and middle of March, when lockdowns began, that stabilization, and in some cases increases, is good news after that tough time. That idea of improvement starting to move in the right direction is reinforced by the labor force survey. Those of you who don't know, the labor force survey is one of the most important data sets for economists tracking the Canadian economy. It's a detailed database of the state of the Canadian labor market. It looks at jobs across different sectors, wages, hours worked, all the different things that tell us how healthy the labor market is at a particular moment. Now, we recently got the data for May, which is the first month in which lockdowns started to be eased. And broadly speaking, the results were positive. We see hours worked, that's the green line on the left there, starting to pick up after some very steep declines in March and April. Similar story for total employment. And the labor force is also picking up, which means that more people are looking for work. And that's a sign of more optimism about future opportunities for employment. So that contributes to the unemployment rate being pushed up a little bit higher, but when we see the labor force increase like that, we take it as a positive trend, one indicative of people's optimism improving. If there is a fly in the ointment, it's represented by my chart on the right there. Now, what we did see in April, as well as in May, was that there were a number of people who were still classified as employed, but who did not work any hours in that month. These are people who still have a job, in some cases are still being paid, but they didn't work any hours because the firm that they work for is still adjusting to reopening plans and dealing with the pandemic. Ultimately, the strength of the recovery in the labor market and the broader Canadian economy will depend on how many of these people ultimately get back to their jobs. That's uncertain at this point, exactly how many there will be. So something to a detail still to be ironed out, as I indicated in the title there. But still, this number is lower than it was last month. And when we look at the trend across the other indicators that I mentioned, still look at May as a month where the trend was positive, which is good news for the economy's further improvement in the coming months. Now, when we're talking about recovery in this case, it's important to acknowledge the gradual nature of it, of the one that we're expecting. The chart on the right it looks at US data, and we're plotting the total kind of overall activity in the economy against the severity of lockdowns. Severity of lockdowns represented by that blue line, which is the US National Social Distancing Index. What we can see is that while those two variables moved in lockstep when lockdowns came into effect, the removal of social distancing restrictions, or the easing of it, has been faster than the pace at which the economy is recovering. So it's not been commensurate. The amount of economic activity picking up has not been commensurate to the pace of social distancing easing. This is something that reflects consumers and businesses still being a little bit cautious about how they spend in this uncertain environment. And it's something that leads to, expectations of a cautious, gradual recovery that we have built into our forecasts. The second thing that I'll point out, in addition to sort of the relationship between removing social distancing measures and overall economic activity, is that social distancing measures are here to stay for some time. We look at all of the different jurisdictions across Canada, a place like BC, for instance, which is further along with respect to reopening and with respect to its curve flattening. Even a place like BC, which has quite a robust reopening plan, there is some form of social distancing in all of its future phases of reopening. That reflects the need to try to contain this virus and do things cautiously, slowly, so that there isn't reactivation. So all that to say, social distancing remaining in place, economic activity not picking up quite as quickly as it dropped, the recovery is likely to be gradual, and as a result, our forecast has Canadian GDP only reaching its pre-virus peak when we get into early 2022. Now, excuse me, just as the contraction in economic activity has been striking, has been in many cases unprecedented, so too is the amount of support from government. And this is one thing that makes us optimistic about the outlook and is good news as we go forward into this. Chart on the left is actually a little bit out of date. It's dated as of May 1st, so about a month and a half ago. But even so, even a month and a half ago, we can see that the amount of fiscal support for the economy from the federal government this time around far outweighs what was offered during the last recession in 2008, 2009. That reflects the severity of this downturn, and it's something that we think will help the economy, has helped the economy already, but will continue to do so going forward. Chart on the right looks at mortgage defaults. The idea being, when we have the kind of unemployment we've been seeing over the last few months, there's inevitably going to be some weakness in the housing market. That is likely going to be the case, but without the policy interventions that have happened, the shock probably would have been quite a bit worse. This is modeling done by the Bank of Canada, but our own models in-house in Scotiabank reveal similar results when we look at this story. Risk at this point, of course, is the possibility of a second wave. This is something that has happened in the past with pandemics, whether it's seasonal impacts or a removal of restrictions and reactivation. This is something that could happen, and depending on the severity of that outbreak, there may be new rounds of restrictions that could also impact economic growth negatively. Looks like we're much better prepared this time around. Most of the forecasts that are out there that have looked at potential downturns from a second wave, the economic hit has not been quite as severe. It's not inevitable that there will be a big peak. We're getting prepared already. We're encouraged by some of the measures that the governments are putting in place to try and prepare. So in all likelihood, we won't have a situation quite as dire economically speaking if we do get that second round of virus infections. But nevertheless, this is a risk and one that's worth highlighting. Just going to talk briefly about telework capacity. This is a Statistics Canada survey that was put out a little while ago, looking at the ability of provincial economies as well as specific industries to work from home, thereby continuing to produce output and generate jobs, even if physical distancing restrictions are in place. As we can see, there are certain industries that are better able to do it. Finance and insurance, educational services, professional, scientific, and technical services, the tech sector. These are industries that at this juncture, and when we look at some of the early data, appear to be better able to withstand the kinds of restrictions on physical gathering that we've seen so far. Turning into the provincial economies, I've talked about Canada so far. We've got the case curves on the right. Chart on the left is our most recent provincial forecast. And there's kind of three things that you need to take out of this. One is that we've had these social distancing restrictions in place. We've had travel restrictions in place. Nobody is immune to that. All of the provinces are expected to witness declines in employment and declines in output this year. That's just the reality of economies shutting down across most industries in the early part of the year. We're starting to see a rebound, as I mentioned, but still when we look at GDP, when we look at employment, the initial part of the year was inevitable, and everyone's going to be impacted on it. The second thing to highlight is that curve flattening is occurring. We are starting to see some earlier reopening in a number of different places. BC, Manitoba, the Maritimes. These are provinces that have managed COVID spread effectively and been able to move towards reopening earlier, which is good for their economies as they start to produce more in the coming months. So the pace of the virus spread is also important for our provincial economies. It's something that we've factored in. The final thing to mention is that the oil-producing provinces in Canada are facing a particularly challenging outlook. This is Alberta, Newfoundland and Labrador, Saskatchewan. They're towards the top there with some of the steepest contractions. And even though those provinces have successfully managed to contain the spread of COVID relative to bigger provinces like Quebec and Ontario, they're dealing with oil price weakness that's emerged during this downturn that should linger and will likely lead to production being cut back, less investment, and less overall employment in those economies.
Mark, if I can just interject here,
sure.
I think this is a really important point for our audience to understand as well, because a number of people in our audience who are still pre-arrival and trying to determine where they should land have previously, many have considered Alberta as a great landing destination, particularly because of the strength of the economy driven by the oil sector. Yep. It seems like, it's going to, based on what we're seeing here, it seems like Alberta and, as you said, the other oil-producing provinces, Newfoundland and Labrador and Saskatchewan, are going to be impacted for a bit longer than simply the impact that COVID is having.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we're anticipating. I don't think we're out of consensus on that. When you have investment activity, employment, job creation so tied to the oil and gas sector, and the oil and gas sector is driven by the price of oil, when we see how weak the price of oil has gotten in the last few months, that doesn't bode well for the economies there. Although there are some uncertainties and some potential opportunities, which I'll get into a little bit later.
Wonderful, thank you.
Just turning to Ontario, I'm going to go through Ontario, Alberta, and BC here, looking at the sectors and the kinds of occupations and how they've been impacted by COVID. It's a similar story actually across Canada, across most of the provinces, where the industries that are doing the worst are trade, hospitality, tourism, sort of the industries that require people to get together and travel. The ones that were first those are the ones that were first impacted by the virus and efforts to contain it, as well as and face a more difficult sort of outlook going forward. We see that in the industries, and we see that in the occupations, looking at the sales and services occupations, culture, recreation. These are the ones that are being hit the hardest. Ones that are not being hit as hard are industries like the higher wage services. This includes things like professional services, engineering, finance, and we're seeing that they haven't done quite as badly. Similar with the natural and applied sciences and management type occupations. These are the ones that are doing a little bit better, have not been hit quite as hard, in part because of the capacity for telework. Similar story in Alberta. As I mentioned, we're seeing this kind of across the board. Trades have been impacted a little bit more there. Contractors, construction, that's an industry that's tied to oil and gas. They've been forced to be a little bit more restricted. But again, trade and hospitality, culture, entertainment, these are the sectors that have been hurt the most. Now, one thing which I'll return to a little bit later is that the primary sector, which is kind of like goods producing, natural resources, it would include oil and gas, hasn't been hit quite as hard in Alberta yet. And there's a couple of possible reasons for that, which I'll get into a little bit later, but something to monitor there. Turning to BC, story is similar again. Initial job losses have been highly concentrated in those tourism, trade, hospitality industries. They witnessed the biggest drops in employment initially, and some of the weaker rebounds when we got into May. Secondary services, I'm seeing a question. That is goods producing that are not natural resources and such. So the big ones there would be manufacturing and construction. So a little bit of mixed results there. They've been hit as well, but not as much as those trade and hospitality jobs. Looking at Ontario, Ontario did witness an improvement in its labor market, just like the national economy, but it hasn't been quite as strong as the overall Canadian picture. And that's at least partly explained by this kind of piecemeal regional reopening that Ontario has. Basically, they're reopening most of the province much more quickly than they're reopening the population centers like Toronto and Hamilton, because those big population centers are where most of the COVID cases are, where most of the virus spread is occurring, and where they still need that containment for a little while. So given that those are the places where a lot of the jobs are and where most of the population goes, this is something that so long as the restrictions remain in place, it might take a little bit longer for Ontario to recover. That's not to say that there won't be opportunities. That's not to say that there won't be a recovery. It just might not be in the next few months, in terms of the number of jobs being created, as strong as other places in the country. Now I want to turn to Alberta here, and it's an interesting story. I mentioned the challenging environment in terms of employment and growth for the oil producers as a result of price weakness translating into weakness in employment and investment. And what's been curious so far in Alberta is that we haven't seen as much of a drop in the labor market in some of those sectors, in the natural resources sector and in the broader economy. With prices weak, you would expect oil companies to reduce drilling because the profit opportunities would be weaker, right? We have seen that in terms of activity being brought down in the oil and gas sector. Rigs drilling in Alberta are very, very low at the moment, but hours worked and jobs haven't taken as much of a hit. One interpretation of this is that the Alberta government actually declared oil and gas production to be an essential industry that wouldn't be subject to the same kind of closures that you might see elsewhere in the country. And so that might offset some of the declines we'd expect in a weak oil price environment, because this is a sector that would be allowed to continue operating. Maybe it wouldn't be elsewhere. Looking forward, however, we're starting to see hours worked and jobs trend a little bit lower in Alberta, especially in the natural resources sector, and that contrasts with the rest of Canada, where things are starting to pick up a little bit more. And this suggests that we may see a little bit of a weaker employment and investment outlook in the next few months in Alberta, even as the lockdowns start to be lifted more and more. But the good news is that oil prices have actually picked up quite substantially since the lows we saw in April. And that's partly because of reopenings happening and the economy picking up, more demand for oil. It's also because production's been scaled back, and that's been supporting prices. And in this environment, anecdotally, we're actually hearing that some companies are starting to pick up production again, back from where it was when it was at those lows, and that could help employment going forward. So it's still challenging in Alberta, it's still challenging in the oil producing provinces, but there's some upside for jobs, we feel, when we look at some of these details. And you may be saying, well, why should we care so much about oil and gas? That's only one industry. We look at the history of Alberta, the last recession, past recessions that have occurred, construction, manufacturing, finance, all these industries and all the different kinds of jobs across them do move in line with the price of oil and the overall activity in the oil and gas sector. So if oil is weaker, if the oil and gas sector is weaker, we can expect weakness in those other sectors a little bit further down the road.
And Mark, if I could just interject there as well, again, I would remind all of our audience, for those of you, who are still in your country of origin and trying to determine where you want to land, we can't stress enough the importance of matching your labor skills with the labor market in the province, in the city in which you're going to land. So, many people have landed previously in Alberta because, and they think of Alberta as a growth environment. It's critical to understand how important the oil economy is to Alberta and its implications on all of these other sectors, Mark, as you were just pointing out. So I just want to really reiterate to people that they really need to do their research around the provincial and local economies when they're doing the assessment of where they want to land. So this information is really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Alberta is the center of Canada's oil and gas producing industry. It's one of the biggest provinces. There's lots of jobs there. There's lots of people working there. But it's important to look at the price of oil when we're thinking about what's happening there. So that's why I raised this. Turning to BC, BC is a province that's done well in the last few years. Very strong labor market, growth across industries. And we feel that it's in a position to benefit as we start to see lockdowns lightened. Tech sector employment has been very strong in BC. As you can see, it actually even performs better, or has performed better over the last few years than places like California and Texas, powerhouses of the tech sector in the US. And this industry, given its ability to work remotely, is one that is in a better position to grow going forward, we feel, looking at the different trends. The other aspect of BC that not so much for the labor market, but just looking at the overall strength of its economy, very tied to Asia in terms of its exports. And so when we start to see places like China, South Korea, Japan, India, Japan to a lesser extent, starting to reopen, that bodes well for BC's growth going forward and for the employment opportunities there. So just finishing up, I wanted to emphasize how beneficial immigration has been for Canada in the last few years. This is something that policymakers cannot take lightly. It has to continue to be part of any economic development strategy in Canada and across the regions in Canada. And I thought I'd leave you with those thoughts. As a result of Newcomers, Canada has been the only population, the only country in the G7 to see its population growth accelerate over the last few years. That's been driven by international migration, mostly immigration, but also international students and temporary foreign workers, people who can come in and contribute to the economy. It's really been a positive story. That's necessary here. You know, we have a declining fertility rate. We need more and more people to come here and help our economy grow. And we've had a situation in the last few years where, as we've increased newcomer attraction, we've seen not only immigrants find more and more jobs, get more and more gainful employment and contribute to the economy, but over that period, there's been growth in the employment rate for people born in Canada as well. So there's more and more of an understanding, I would say, in Canada that you bring people in and it's not displacing others from jobs. Immigrants are contributing to Canada's economy. They've been a huge boost over the last few years, and they will need to continue to be for any policymaker looking at trying to grow the economy going forward. So all of you, it's very important that you continue to come here and continue to contribute to the economy. And this will remain a feature. There will remain opportunities, we think, for people to come here. It may shift. This is a different kind of world event that we're dealing with now. But immigration is absolutely essential to Canada's economy, and it should continue to be in the future. I'll leave you just where I began, which is to say that there are risks. There are still challenges to be dealt with, especially when we think about the oil-producing provinces and the role that the oil and gas sector should play in Canada's economy. But nevertheless, we do look to be coming out of that trough. There's been a little bit of, we would call it an inflection point, where things are starting to improve. We're starting to trend positively. And we're hopeful, in light of everything, that that can continue over the next few months, next few years, generating more and more opportunities for employment to contribute to the economy for everyone who's here. We have a Twitter page if you are interested in reading our analysis on various topics. Please follow us. Please reach out to us. This is Scotiabank Economics, and we put tons of stuff out there. And so that's my contact information. I'm happy to take your questions now. And I'll also just emphasize that if you do have questions that come to you afterwards, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll do our best to answer them.
Marc, this is wonderful. Thank you so much. Before we turn it over to questions, and there have been a number of questions that have come in, and I want to remind everyone, please submit your questions in the Q&A section. We're going to turn to them in short order. Again, I would ask that you give us a little bit of information to help better answer the question. If you can tell us where you're coming from, where you intend to land, maybe your occupational background, and then your question, that will help immensely. Before we turn to questions, Marc, I have written some notes on some of the points that you had made. Interestingly, you had talked about the high wage services that have been less impacted than many other sectors. Those high wage services, engineering, IT, finance. Many of our audience are coming into the country with backgrounds just like those sectors, engineering, IT, finance. So does that bode well for newcomers?
Yeah, that's a great question. Clearly it has not, those pieces of the economy, those parts of the economy have not been hit as hard as others. They're less subject to, or less restricted, I should say, by physical distancing restrictions. They've been able to grow quite substantially over the last few years. These are the industries of the future. So, certainly I would say at the highest level, yes, the fact that those industries have not been hit quite as hard as others, like say construction, manufacturing, those retail jobs. If you are a person who possesses those skills and is looking to get into those industries, they have a better, they appear at this point anyway to have stronger growth prospects and hiring prospects than other industries. Oh, I think you cut out there, David. I'm having trouble hearing you. Can you hear me? I'm having trouble hearing you.
Hi, Mark.
Hi.
It looks like Dave just disconnected. He is reconnecting right now.
Okay.
But I can start you on some of the questions
Sure.
if you'd like.
Sure, happy to.
So I have this first question from Deepak. He's asking, hi, can you share the impact on banking jobs and hiring? As I understand, due to high provisions due to COVID, banks will incur losses, new businesses will slow, and in turn, hiring may take a hit.
Yeah, that's a great question. Everybody is being hit by COVID. Certainly at Scotiabank, we were, like other banks, set aside some provisions for losses, for loan losses. Everyone's being impacted. Certainly not going to come out of this right away. COVID's going to have long-lasting impacts. The economy's not faring well. But again, when I look at the breakdown of jobs so far, the prospects for telework, a number of these different factors, I would say that a sector like banking, finance and insurance, real estate and leasing is probably not in as much of a challenging position as other industries like, say, retail, accommodations, and tourism.
Mark, Ben, sorry about that. I had some technical difficulties here. Ben, thanks for stepping in like that. Mark, thanks for your patience. And to our audience, thanks for your patience. Mark, what I was saying just before I was cut out, I wanted to remind our audience that please take advantage of a number of the exhibitors in our online fair today, particularly Next Stop Canada, as well as the British Columbia Construction Association Integrating Newcomers program. If you visit their booths, both of these stakeholder providers have free pre-arrival training programs for newcomers that will help get you ready for the Canadian job market. These programs are funded by the Canadian government. They are at no cost to you as a newcomer. And part of the program is they will help to develop one-on-one action plans to get you ready for the Canadian labor market. So please take advantage of those two exhibitors. Visit all of the exhibitors, but those are two exhibitors particularly that can help get you ready. Regardless of whether you come with an engineering, IT, finance background, the backgrounds that we were talking about, or any other background, please visit those booths. They're going to be able to help develop your your one-on-one action plan. That was one point that I wanted to make. The other point, Mark, I wanted to make is, and thankfully you've spent some time talking about Alberta, Ontario, and BC, where the bulk of newcomers land. But I also wanted to just share with our audience the importance of considering smaller centers across the country. Some of the smaller provinces like Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Atlantic Canada, particularly Atlantic Canada, is doing a lot to attract newcomers. And Atlantic Canada has actually been relatively unscathed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Within our fair today, we in fact have an exhibitor, the city of Fredericton, that has lots of job opportunities and is a great opportunity for newcomers, not only because of the labor market in the smaller center, but also one of the things that we remind newcomers about is the cost of living. If you're landing in some of these bigger or highly populated provinces, cost of living is high. Some of these smaller centers can really, you can afford a great lifestyle. So just wanted to share that with our audience. So please take advantage of having the city of Fredericton exhibiting. Visit their booth as well to find out what opportunities exist in smaller centers. Mark, I know I may be putting you on the spot here, but what are your thoughts on some of the smaller locations across the country as landing destinations?
Well, I think that's a great point, David. I focused my presentation on the three provinces you mentioned, just because they're larger and, by definition, there will be more jobs there because they're larger. But plenty of opportunities. I mean, of course, everything's challenging now with COVID, but plenty of opportunities in some of the mid-sized and smaller provinces. Atlantic Canada has certainly been a place that's attracted and retained a lot of newcomers. Been big contributors to their economies there. Even a place like PEI, which is the smallest Canadian province, has seen a lot of growth in some of the services industries with immigrants filling some of those jobs. New Brunswick as well is one that's brought in a lot of people. Nova Scotia, more diversified kind of services-based economy in Halifax and the capital city there. There are opportunities there. Also, when we get into places like Manitoba, very diversified economy there, kind of flies under the radar. And, finance and insurance sector, different kinds of advanced manufacturing, construction's always one there. Developing some tech and IT services kind of industries there. They're not as big, but they're growing, and a lot of governments are targeting growth for those industries. So there are opportunities. There were opportunities developing before this pandemic hit. And as you mentioned, David, lower cost of living in these places than certainly in Toronto and Vancouver, and all the house price appreciation we've seen there. And as you mentioned, as I kind of alluded to, these places have not had as severe caseloads. They tend to be a little bit further along with respect to reopening. And that bodes well for more hiring and more economic growth in the next few months for some of these smaller provinces.
That is great. Thanks so much, Mark. And we'll get right into the questions because they've been coming in fast and furious. A question from Jawahar. Do you believe HVAC industry would still be a sector of promise for newcomers? I'm planning to land in Vancouver.
I'm sorry, I had a little bit of trouble hearing you. What industry?
The HVAC industry.
The HVAC?
So that, Johar, I would recommend that you visit the British Columbia Construction Association booth. They're exhibiting in our fair. They, in fact, not only for you with an HVAC background, but also for anyone who's got a construction-related background or transferable skills that are applicable to the construction industry, engineering, IT, architecture, project management. If you've got any of those skills, BCCA Integrating Newcomers program is something that you should look at. Again, these are one of the people that I was talking about earlier. They will help prepare through a one-on-one process a personalized action plan to help you get ready for the labor market. So please take advantage of their presence here in the fair today. So Mark, I think we can skip to the next question.
Mm-hmm.
Given the situation of COVID-19, what is the future for newcomers who are HR professionals who are planning to land in Canada in the next 6 months? That's part one. And are there any prerequisites for them? And what is the demand for HR jobs?
That's a good question. Prerequisites, I would take a look at that probably at some of the booths that are on display here at the fair. That's not so much of a something that I cover in my work. I mean, I think in terms of HR jobs, not an industry that I necessarily look at in great detail, but I would imagine that there would be call for that. There's going to be a need for, people who can operate remotely and deal with staffing decisions as companies start to move forward into this new world where we're doing so much of things online. I can't, purely anecdotally, I can't imagine that would be a sector that would go out of vogue or not have demand for it, but not something I've looked at in great detail.
Absolutely understandable. And Samir, what I would suggest here again is a couple of things. To all of you in attendance here today, I want to remind people that Prepare for Canada has in its ebook section of our website, prepareforcanada.com, over 20 different career pathways ebooks designed for different professions and trades. HR is one of the professions and trades that we cover off. So Samir, please download that career pathway ebook. It will give you some great information that addresses the prerequisites that you talk about. So please take advantage of that career pathway ebook in our Prepare for Canada section. And to all of you, I'd recommend that you visit that section to get your specific profession or trade covered off. The next question comes from Navneet. My husband and I are coming from Dubai. We're landing in Toronto, June 2020. We are quarantining in an Airbnb. What is the scenario for the retail and advertising sector? So, Mark, I'll take one stab at the first part. That's great news, Navneet, that you're quarantining. And to all of you, please be reminded, if you're landing in Canada, you need to have a quarantine plan that you can present upon landing. If you visit the Prepare for Canada booth, we have a downloadable link where you can, that is an action plan to help you develop your own personalized quarantine plan. Please take advantage of that. All of you will need that. You can be refused at the border if you do not have a quarantine plan for yourself. So please, it's really critical. Now, Meet, I'm grateful to hear that you brought that up. It's really important. So now, Mark, over to you, the retail and advertising sectors in Ontario.
Yeah, well, as I kind of mentioned in the presentation, retail is a sector that's being challenged by this, right? We are these kinds of traditional establishments where it requires people to come into stores and gather in groups. They're the ones that are being most impacted by COVID and the physical distancing restrictions. So I think retail is facing a challenging outlook, like a few different sectors. It's one of the ones that faces a more challenging outlook. We are moving into reopening. We are operating at partial capacity in a lot of parts of the province of Ontario and a lot of parts of Canada. So the situation does look to be improving. And companies are increasingly finding ways to, adapt to a world where only a certain number of people can come into stores. That's good news as well. But generally, I would say that, that's a sector that's facing a challenging situation when we look at the nature of this particular downturn. Marketing and advertising, not something that, again, that I look at in great detail, but, like all industries, I think companies and different people who are operating within the sector are looking for ways to do things online. And, more and more of that digital presence and figuring out how to do things that way in light of the situation we're in. So that would be my totally non-expert opinion on that, things you could look into.
Absolutely. And just I'll before I move on to the next question, Navneet, I'll mention in our Career Pathways ebook section, we do have a book for sales and marketing. I would highly recommend that you sales, marketing, advertising. I'd highly recommend that you download that ebook. In each of the ebooks, regardless of the profession or trade, we talk about which professions or trades are regulated or unregulated. Really importantly, we talk about where there are professional immigrant networking groups. These are groups that are designed to help newcomers in those specific sectors or trades break into a networking group that can help connect you with influencers in those particular sectors. Networking is critically important for your job search here in Canada. That information, professional immigrant networking groups, are all part of the information that we have included in those particular Career Pathways ebooks. Please download those ebooks for your particular profession or trade. And I'm going to put a plug into Scotiabank right now. All of those ebooks are sponsored by Scotiabank. We're able to give all of this information to you at no charge because of the sponsorship with Scotiabank. So we're really grateful to Scotiabank. Marc, there are a couple of questions that have come in regarding the banking sector. Can you share the impact on banking jobs and hiring? I know this may have been the question that you were answering when I resumed. I understand due to high provisions due to COVID, banks will incur losses, new business will slow, and in turn, hiring will take a hit.
Yeah, well, I don't want to comment on the banking outlook or hiring opportunities or anything like that at the organization I'm part of. But I think when we look at results from the quarters that have come out in the second quarter, that have come out in the last little while, we are seeing that banks are dealing with COVID just like everybody else, and the outlook isn't great with respect to how to hiring and to to growth within the industry, just like it is across most of the economy. But I will say that the higher wage jobs in in finance and insurance, in professional, scientific, and technical services, those have been thus far less impacted by COVID in places like Ontario, Alberta, BC than other sectors like, say, tourism or construction, manufacturing.
And Marc, is there a distinction to be made between the banking sector and finance generally?
I think whether you work for a bank or some other organization within the financial services industry, that's something that you have to determine yourself, what kind of opportunities are available for you and what kind of thing works for you. Certainly, Canada has a big financial services sector. It's across a lot of different provinces, across all the provinces, some more than others. And there's lots of different kinds of roles and different kinds of organizations you can work for.
Great, thank you. Next question comes from Prachi. He wants to know, about the IT sector and which provinces right now in today's scenario seem to be doing better than other provinces. The IT sector performance sort of broken out by province. And Marc, I know you touched on that a bit, so I'll turn that back over to you.
Yeah, great question. I don't have any data on the IT sector employment so far. I don't have that in the presentation. Probably would have been an interesting thing to include. You know, we look at the recent history, you look at real GDP, and I'm just going to flip back to my old slide a little while back. Oh, that's employment. Well, when we look at employment, when we look at GDP, the province that's generated the most growth in IT, in tech sector in the last 10 years has been BC. That's just what the numbers tell us. I've got the chart on the left here that shows that. It's the province that's done the best in terms of growth and employment, job creation. That doesn't mean that's the only place with opportunities. You know, I think what a place like BC probably has going for it, generally speaking, in the near term, is the fact that it's a little bit further along with its reopening plans. It's you know, got a more contained caseload of COVID across the province, so that bodes well for earlier reopening. But you know, Ontario remains a place with tons and tons of advantages. More and more industries available there, lots and lots of companies in the tech sector operating within Ontario, not just in Toronto, but also in places like Ottawa and in cities around Toronto. And, you know, as I mentioned, you know, other provinces are making efforts to try and grow their tech sectors, to try and diversify in the next few years. We've seen some growth in places like Nova Scotia, Manitoba. It's developing. I actually, you know, in my world, the Saskatchewan budget came out this week, and there was a whole section there about, you know, wanting to continue to grow the tech sector in the next few years. So there are opportunities everywhere. It's really just a question of, well, where are you going to have the kind of experience you want to have, and where are the particular firms and particular kinds of roles that would be best suited for you and your skill set?
Mark, great question. And there are a ton more questions coming in. So I'm going to say this. We've got an hour booked with Mark. So I'm going to get to the questions that I think are specific for Mark. And on reaching our hour, we're going to thank Mark. Well, thank you, Mark, for your presentation here, and let you get on, because we hadn't booked more than that time. So we'll let you get on with your day, and I'll take the questions on myself. So let's get to a couple of questions that are specifically, I think, better for you. This question comes from Harmon, who's currently in Toronto. What are the permanent changes do you expect to see in consumer spending?
In consumer spending?
Yeah. Yes.
Well, the employment outlook has been challenging across Canada. We've seen jobs being lost, and that's one of the main drivers of consumer spending when we look at the drivers over the longer run. So that certainly doesn't bode well for consumption. But you know, we're hopeful that as economies start to reopen more and more, and we start to increase job creation, that we'll start to see a bit of a pickup in overall consumption.
Okay, great. Mark, there are a number of comments that have come in just thanking you for your time. So on behalf of everyone in the audience, I want to thank you. A few more economic related questions. Will home rentals in large Canadian cities fall in the wake of COVID? And what correction do you see in the property market?
Yeah, great question. We've gotten a lot of questions about the housing market over the last few years, or over the last few months. One of the things that we think is really important when we're looking at that sector is the pace of population growth. And, you know, it's great that the Canadian government is remaining committed to its immigration objectives, but there's no question that not quite as much immigration will be coming in over the next few months, given border closures and travel restrictions and everything related to COVID. So it's going to be important for population growth to resume in the coming months if we're to see housing markets continue to grow. But, you know, Generally speaking, thus far, we haven't seen much of a dip in prices, just because both the supply and the demand side of the market are being impacted. And we're hopeful that prices can remain relatively stable in the near term, but it will depend a lot on population growth.
Okay, wonderful. Marc, I know we are now, sorry, one last question that has come in for you. And that is, Amit is, it's more of a comment. Based on what Amit has heard, he's interpreting that the chances of getting employment are better in BC than Ontario. How would you respond to that?
Well, as I mentioned, every province has its own opportunities. If you are looking for a particular job in a particular sector, you've got to make a decision about where the best opportunities for you in particular are, where you can find the best networks, where you'll be most comfortable with the quality of life, with the kind of life you can have there. We do think that BC's economy will perform a little bit better than Ontario's this year. There's a number of different factors behind that, one of which is reopenings happening a little bit more quickly. The initial job losses haven't been quite as pronounced. So that just suggests that growth rates will be, shouldn't call it a growth rate, the rate of contraction will not be as pronounced in BC this year than as it will be in Ontario. But, that's not to say that BC is unequivocally better. You've got to make the right decision for yourself. And while that province certainly has opportunities for some people, Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, all kinds of places around Canada have other opportunities there as well. And, anybody coming to Canada should consider all of the different provinces and some of the benefits that they offer.